I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to episode 127 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. Today we have an interview with Colleen Gleason.
C.M. Gleason is a pen name for author Colleen Gleason. Born in Detroit, Colleen Gleason spent most of her adult life in Michigan. She attended the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, receiving her B.A. in English, and later went on to obtain her M.B.A. from the University of Michigan in Flint. Her passion has always been writing fiction, and in late 2005, she sold her first 2 books to New American Library, a division of the Penguin Group. Colleen currently lives near Ann Arbor and writes full-time in a number of different genres. Murder at the Capitol is the 3rd book in the Lincoln's White House Mystery Series. July 1861. On Independence Day, the citizens of Washington, D.C. are celebrating as if there isn't a war, but the city is teeming with green Union recruits, while President Lincoln and his War Department are focused on military strategy to take Richmond in Secessionist Virginia in order to bring the conflict to a swift end. The very next morning, as Congress convenes once more, a dead body is found hanging from the crane beneath the unfinished dome of the Capitol. Lincoln's close confidant, Adam Speed Quinn, is called upon to determine whether the man had taken his own life or if someone had helped him. With the assistance of Dr. George Hilton and journalist Sophie Gates, Quinn investigates what turns out to be murder.
Today, we are speaking with Colleen Gleason. She writes as C.M. Gleason, among others. We are going to talk to her about her book, Murder at the Capitol. Welcome, Colleen.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be here.
Research is obviously key in your writing. Have you ever come across any research that turned your writing process upside down?
Absolutely. And this series is set during the Civil War in Washington, D.C. It's based around the Lincoln presidency. Murder at the Capitol happens to be the 3rd book in the series. They can all be read separately or out of order, but if you want the full historical arc of both the characters and what was happening in Washington at the time, you'd want to start with Murder at the Lincoln White House. When I first started researching this series, I didn't really know all that much about the Civil War. I mean, I knew the basics. I started getting into a lot of details, and one of the things that surprised me and actually gave me the idea for the 2nd book in the series, which is Murder in the Oval Library, was that I learned that there was absolutely no security in or around the White House during this time. Even after the war started, which actually takes place near the end of my 2nd book in the series, there was no security. The president walked around. He walked from the White House to the Treasury Department to the War Department by himself often. And every day, anyone could simply walk into the White House at any time and wait in line for an opportunity to speak to President Lincoln or anybody else who they thought might be able to help them with whatever they were coming to the White House for. Side note, at that time, the president's house was actually called either the president's house or the executive mansion. It wasn't until Lincoln came upon the scene, he started calling it this great White House, or the White House. And that was kind of the first time that it's noticed that the residence was called the White House. There's people who walk into the White House at any time, and they would wait in long lines all day, every day, for an opportunity to speak with the president, whose bedroom and that of his wife and that of his sons was all on the same floor as his office and what they called the library at the time, the Oval Library, where the kids, Tad and Willie and Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, would hang out in the evenings. Also, his secretary's offices, they were all on the same floor, which is the second floor of the White House. it was possible that President Lincoln or Mrs. Lincoln could come out of their bedroom and find people waiting in the hall to speak to them, and there was no security whatsoever. That was where I got the kernel of an idea for the second book in the series, and that was one of the things that I learned when I was researching. I wouldn't say it threw me for a loop, but it gave me a really interesting path down which to go.
Well, that is absolutely crazy that there was no security.
None at all. And everybody would argue with the president, especially because right after he was elected, he started getting death threats and all sorts of presents from the South. He would get pies and bourbons, breads that would be sent to him. And of course, he wouldn't eat them because who knew what present was added to those delicacies. But he got all sorts of threats from the very beginning.
So there was no Secret Service?
There was no Secret Service. His security was basically Alan Pinkerton and his people, which, by the way, included a woman at the time. And there was a woman, the name escapes me at the moment, but she was actually instrumental in helping to break open the Baltimore assassination plot, which was one of the reasons that Lincoln came into Washington, D.C. in the dead of night instead of going through Baltimore as planned. You might know this being from Maryland. Can't remember her name, but she was one of the undercover detectives who helped learn the information so Lincoln was able to evade that plot and not get caught in Baltimore. So there was no Secret Service. His security was basically Pinkerton and friends or people that he hired that just protected him. It wasn't like what we think of the Secret Service right now. There also was no police force to speak of in Washington, D.C. at the time. There were constables whose responsibility was basically to stop any sort of crime in action. So if they saw somebody breaking in or somebody assaulting someone, they would stop it. But there wasn't an investigative force. There was also the night watchmen who were responsible to watch over and protect the national buildings, like the War Department, the Treasury. They didn't have any monuments at the time except for part of the Washington Monument. But that's all their job was to kind of patrol around those buildings and protect them. So that's one of the reasons that Adam Quinn, who's my main character in this series, gets roped into solving murders because there's no entity that did that in Washington at the time. Now, in August of 1861, which was right after Lincoln was inaugurated, he finally did implement a police force. That was after the first 3 books in my series, so we don't have a police force at that time. Maybe more information than you wanted, but that's some of the interesting things I learned when I was doing all this research.
That is really interesting, and it leads us into the next question because, as you said, we do live in Maryland, but we do take Washington, D.C.'s history for granted. It's such a large part of history in such a small area. Have you spent much time there for research, or have you done this as an armchair researcher?
I love Washington, D.C., and I've been there many times. I don't even know how many times I've been there prior to starting the research on this book. So I definitely had a feel for the way the city's laid out and where it was positioned. Once I started the series, I had written, I think, 2 books before I actually got there physically, but having been there so many times, I really felt I knew the city fairly well. And of course, what's there now is very different than what was there in 1861. So just by virtue of the fact that I was looking at what the city was like however many years ago, I did a lot of research for it. You probably know that the city was a complete mud bowl. It was almost like a backwards little town. People would come over from Europe expecting this beautiful capital city from this upstart American country. They find this little rinky-dink town that looks like it belongs in the Old West. Well, at the time, it wasn't the Old West, but in the West. And they were just kind of shocked coming from places like Paris and London and seeing this little tiny town with very permanent buildings and only one paved street, which was really cobblestones. And so you probably know a lot about that, having grown up in the area or living in the area.
Actually, no.
Well, now you do. Since you asked about research, I am working on ideas for the 4th book, which will be Murder at the Smithsonian. I was able to get a private tour of the Smithsonian Castle by the curator of the museum when I was in Washington, D.C. a year ago, May. So I got to see the area of the castle that was the apartments where Sophie Gates and Dr. Joseph Henry, her uncle, lived. I have gotten some in-depth research now that I'm into the series a little bit. So that was very fun to go into the basement of the Smithsonian Castle, to go to the upstairs, to look out the tower windows and see what it was like.
Oh, I'm jealous.
Yeah, me too. I've always been awestruck by the fact that we have so many pictures of the Civil War. You think of it as being such ancient history. Actually, there were quite a few photographs. We're just curious if you used any of those photographs to help you visualize for your book.
Absolutely. And having written books set in the Middle Ages and also books set in the 1820s, I love having visuals, like actual real photographs to look at for when I'm doing my research, because it's one thing to read what someone is writing about an era, the way they describe it, and to infer from that. But it's another thing to actually see photographs and be able to make my own descriptions and look for certain things that maybe are details that wouldn't necessarily be in a nonfiction book. So absolutely, for my research, I rely heavily on photographs for certain things, like how people looked, maybe the clothing they would wear, what the streets looked like, that kind of a feel. Also, they even have some aerial photographs, not photographs, they were able to do some aerial maps of Washington at the time, I'm assuming from a balloon, and somebody drew them. I think there's actually at least one or two photos. I've used those as well. And I also rely heavily on diaries from people who lived in D.C. at the time, as well as newspapers, just to get some of the nitty-gritty day-to-day things that were happening, like how much it would cost for a pair of boots or what kinds of businesses were on a certain block, that kind of thing. And then, of course, I use history books, of which there are countless books about the Civil War on pretty much any topic you can imagine, including one entire book on Abraham Lincoln and food.
Interesting.
Well, speaking of which, your descriptions of the Capitol building under construction, it brought everything to life, and the mass of the soldiers that were quartering there, and they had no place to go, so they were sleeping in the Capitol building. The fact that was a bakery in the basement of the Capitol building, I just thought that was really odd and interesting.
And I looked and scoured the web for pictures of that bakery because I really wanted to get a feel for what it was like, especially since, as you know, there's a scene that takes place in that bakery. The only thing I could find was a drawing. Someone had done a drawing of it, which that's fine. That's probably very accurate. But I really was hoping for an actual photograph just to get a sense for the lighting and the details. Wasn't able to find ones. Can't have it all. I can have a book about Abraham Lincoln and his food, but cannot find a picture of the bakery in the Capitol.
Some of your characters in Murder at the Capitol would turn heads at the time. Adam Quinn, the protagonist, is an amputee investigator. Sophie Gates is a woman reporter, and Dr. George Hilton is a free African-American doctor. Were there true examples of such people as these in history?
Let's start with Dr. Hilton first. Absolutely, Dr. George Hilton, his history anyway, is based very heavily on Dr. Alexander Augusta, was a physician who was an African-American free man, and he was the medic for the Black Regiment out of Washington, D.C. for the Union Army. His history is very similar to that of my fictional George Hilton. Basically, when they were young, they learned to read on the DL. In both cases, it was a religious man. For Dr. Hilton, it was a Quaker, and for Dr. Augusta, it was an Episcopalian bishop. They learned to read and they were taught basic learning skills, and then they apprenticed with a doctor, and then they both went to medical school in Canada, because until after the Civil War was over, there were no medical schools in the United States that would allow blacks. And even after the Civil War, the main medical schools for blacks were ones that were started and run by African Americans. Because I knew that was an unusual thing to have a free black doctor pre-Civil War, I wanted to find an actual example, and so I used that to give Dr. Hilton his background. As far as why and how he was a free man, that also is based in history. Also, Elizabeth Keckley, who was a free black woman who was well known in Washington, D.C. for making dresses for many of the women of society, including Verena Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife, and of course had to leave when the Civil War started. She also made dresses for Mrs. Lincoln. And Elizabeth Keckley was able to buy her own freedom because during that time period, slaves were often leased out to families, to Congress people who would come into Washington while Congress was in session and then go home. A slave-owning family in or around the area might lease their slaves to these visiting families or these temporary residents. And what was interesting was the slaves themselves were able to negotiate their own lease rate, which is horrific just to even talk about that. Their owners would get the base, and then they would get anything that they could negotiate over that base amount. So that's how many of them could save money to buy themselves or their family members freedom. And so in my story, that's what I had Dr. Hilton's mother. She bought her own freedom by saving money based on her lease rate, and he was born after she was a free woman, so he was born free. Now, Adam Quinn is a frontiersman. He was also a trapper and a tracker in Wisconsin before he moved out to Kansas, and he lived with the Native Americans. He lived with an Ojibwa tribe and learned tracking and trapping. I always felt that having a man who was very attuned to detail and looking at tracks and reading signs would be an excellent detective.